Hello, I'm Katie Ashby-Koppens, Head of Legal, Voices for Freedom and Reality Check Radio. We are joined here today by Emeritus Professor Ramesh Thakur and Dr. David Bell. We are here today to talk about a couple of documents that are being drafted by the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is the health agency of the United Nations, and the World Health Organization has been busy writing two documents over the last couple of years that relate to pandemics, and they say they're being prepared in the name of being pandemic ready for the next pandemic. These documents are often talked about separately, but they are also very much being drafted together, and they are effectively going to change the way that pandemics are managed in the future. One, we can expect a lot more pandemics, but we've also just lived through the last 4 years. So it's going to be voted on at the end of May, in a couple of weeks' time. We've not seen final versions of these documents. In fact, the W.H.O continues to work on them over the last couple of weeks, and it's a question of when we will be expecting, well, we should have expected them a long time ago, but it'll be a question of when we see them. Our position is, and my position clearly is that these documents should not be voted upon until we've had ample opportunity to consider them. The ramifications under these documents are huge. Businesses will be able to be, well, countries will be able to be locked down, businesses will be affected, and it will be a very, very different landscape to what we've just experienced over the last 4 years, because we'll have an unelected official making decisions on behalf of all of the member state countries, including New Zealand. Dr. David Bell is a former WHO scientist and was with the WHO for 11 years, I believe. 9 years. And Ramesh Thakur was the former General Secretary of the United States. You just got a promotion. As former Assistant General Secretary of the United Nations. And these gentlemen are very skilled in their own fields, but they're more than appropriate to be talking to us today about the WHO pandemic treaties. So I'll pass over to Professor Thakur.
Thanks, Katie. Let me start by way of a preamble with referencing something my former boss, the late Kofi Annan, used to say. All the world's major global problems, he pointed out, terrorism, nuclear weapons, financial crises, climate change, even pandemics, are essentially problems without passports, and therefore they need solutions without passports. How ironic, therefore, that one of the solutions at the direction of the WHO in the last few years was vaccine passports. And I start with that because of the contradictions that are inherent. What we have in the two accords is an effort to entrench and institutionalize a system of medical, political, social, and even messaging control that actually was at the behest of and under the supervision of the WHO, but whose results long-term are proving to be extremely damaging rather than beneficial. The benefits are hard to discern. The problems are becoming more and more evident with each passing month. The concerns over the accords have centered a lot in public debate around sovereignty issues. These concerns are real. The efforts to deny them take a very formulaic and legalistic approach. They amount to a distinction without a difference, in that it is an effort to institutionalize plausible deniability on both sides. The WHO will say, we are merely issuing advisories and recommendations. States will say, we are only implementing recommendations that the WHO has given, which come from legally binding accords that we have undertaken to abide by. And if we don't implement them, we will place ourselves outside international law and become rogue states. And therefore, by pointing the finger at the other, each absolves itself. We end up with a system that we are going to sign on to that creates new powers on the WHO, including discretionary power on the Director General, without responsibility or accountability on either side. That is the opposite of democratic practice and convention that we should have. So that's the first, and from my point of view, the most important point. The others, the details of which I expect David will go into, include the fact that there is no urgency. Pandemics are rare events. The disease burden they impose are very, very low, separately but equally, both in developing countries and in industrialized countries. The big killer diseases in these two groups are different, particularly taken over long stretches of time. Then there is a question of, is health handled better at the local level or at the global level? Our answer and our experience is it is always better at the local level. You cooperate at the global level internationally, but you don't hand over control, and you certainly don't give them power to dictate. At the moment, under the Accords, the Director General will have the sole and ultimate authority to determine and to declare a pandemic emergency. Under that system, the Director General and the WHO will acquire greater powers, including the power to claim resources from governments. Now, what could go wrong with a system where the person and the institution are given the power to create an emergency, which gives them more personnel, more money, more resources and powers? There are also additional questions of conflicts of interest in terms of the funding structure that the WHO operates by, which has badly distorted the relationship between the private sector, in particular pharmaceutical interests, and the public interest and the public sector. That we need to be aware of. Then, returning to my opening point, the reality is WHO performance in managing COVID was far from exemplary, starting with the fact that they departed from their own global pandemic preparedness plan that was published as recently as September 2019. So just a few months before this pandemic broke out. And then a series of other things, including the investigation, the whitewash of the investigation, the denial initially that human-to-human transmission is even possible, the insistence of zoonotic origins in the wet market as opposed to the possibility of a lab leak, which, by the way, now increasingly looks more than likely, and the consensus is shifting quite dramatically towards that. So given all that, the higher priority ought to be to convene or institute a genuinely independent, robust, impartial, and credible inquiry into the WHO performance, identify lessons learned in terms of both what was done right and what were done wrong, and then do reforms after that. This is back to front. So pause, put it on hold, think it through properly, and only then sign a new agreement that does give us a better system of international cooperation without handing over control and responsibility from states to the WHO, and leaves in place mechanisms where we can hold each of the decision-making layers from the local through the national all the way to the global accountable for their actions, their decisions, and their performance.
David, you have just recently been involved in a couple of peer review papers that have been published by the University of Leeds, in particular on the likelihood of pandemic risk and also the cost of what these documents the effect and the cost of what these documents will have on nations. Would you like to expand on those?
Yeah, thanks. So the University of Leeds put out two publications, The Cost of Pandemics, just in the last week or so, and a couple of months ago, Rational Policy Over Panic. And they're looking at the evidence base around the pandemic agenda and what's behind the WHO messaging, World Bank and G20 in particular. And yeah, it's important to go into this. So pandemics happen occasionally. Outbreaks of disease happen. They're a tiny burden, and they're relatively rare events. But the initiatives of the WHO that Ramesh has outlined are essentially trying to put this front and centre of public health. And the bulk of the funding is moving to make it front and centre of public health. And the reason for that really is that the World Health Organization is essentially a public-private partnership. It's significantly funded by private money, about 20 to 25%. And when corporate or private money is given to an organisation, it's to get return on investment. So we're commoditising public health through this. And there are other public-private partnerships such as Gavi and COVID who are very strongly behind this agenda. So if we look at the frequency of outbreaks, a good example is the WHO priority disease list. People have heard about disease X, which is on that list. So it has COVID, which almost certainly was due to gain-of-function research. So it's essentially a result of the sort of initiative around vaccines and pandemics which we're seeing and the money that's being put into that. Then there is on that list Ebola and Lassa fever. This is the WHO's priority list. So they're confined to West Africa and Central Africa because of the zoonotic carriers of those. And then there's a list of about 7 diseases such as SARS, MERS, Crimea, Congo, hemorrhagic fever, etc. And none of these in the whole of human history has caused more than 1,000 deaths. So people forget SARS-1 caused about 800 deaths, MERS the same. These are tiny, that's about 6 hours of tuberculosis in terms of mortality. The Gideon database that the G20 and World Bank heavily use as a reference, it shows from about 1960 an increase in outbreaks, in natural outbreaks, in recording of them, which we expect because we've invented the ways to detect them. We've invented PCR, we've invented antigen tests, serology tests, and gene sequencing. So we can detect things like Nipah virus that we could never detect before. They're not new, but we can detect them. And over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a reduction in the number of outbreaks and a reduction in mortality from outbreaks in these big databases. So this is quite the opposite of what WHO is saying. It's the opposite of what the World Bank and the G20 are saying, but it's from the very references that they use and they rely on. So essentially, they are driving this with misinformation about the risk and the frequency and the burden of pandemics. And the funding that's going to go into this, we're talking in these documents about $30 to $40 billion, not including the surge financing and other financing that's in the pandemic agreement per year. That's about 10 times what we fund for the WHO in total now. And we're talking about 25 to 50% of foreign aid, of overseas development assistance. So what this will do is massively skew global health, massively skew investment in mitigating diseases. So we will take money from malaria, we'll take money from tuberculosis and the big killers, heart disease, etc., nutrition, sanitation, and we will put them in something which is essentially a tiny burden and a rare event, but which generates huge profits for the sponsors of this process, which is the private pharmaceutical lobby essentially and their investors, and a number of countries, Western countries, that are very heavily invested in pharmaceuticals. And we're building a complex where a large part of the global public health workforce will be behind this. The salaries are there, the career opportunities are there, so they will back this. And public health has been used in this way in the past to push a corporate authoritarian agenda. People should be very aware of that. So it's not a new thing that we're seeing, because you can use fear in health and to drive the sort of authoritarian approaches that has been outlined. So yeah, I think clearly this needs a rethink. Countries should not be signing these. They should be, at a minimum, postponing this till they've looked at the finances and they've looked at the risk. Because the messaging behind it that is being pushed in is essentially false messaging in terms of both of these. So yeah, it's not driven by public health, and we should stop seeing that. It's driven by something related to profit that is very different and is not going to end up benefiting most people.
Ramesh, what do you think the consequences are if countries, refuse to adopt, accept, sign up to these documents?
If it forces them to look at the concerns and look at the relative burdens of risk and the relative benefits of the different allocation of resources, the consequences are all beneficial. If there is no urgency, I don't see the problem. I don't think there's any negative consequence that comes from this whatsoever. It's just a delay. So they're themselves promoting this as a generational change. If it's that important, that makes it even more imperative that we look at it carefully and think it through and work on every single clause and make sure we get it right. It doesn't mean we should rush it through. On the contrary, it means we should do it in a more deliberate manner and open it up to independent analysts as well. It should not be run as a closed-door thing where the technocrats take over responsibility. It has enormous educational, social, political consequences. And therefore, you need to bring in a wider range of expertise. Many of the mistakes we made during COVID was to narrow down the range of advice from one sector. And now, in a recent survey in the UK, about 25% of scientists are saying the government should have listened to a much broader range of expert advice, including psychologists, for example, psychiatrists, if you like, and economists in terms of the burden of inflation that we have imposed on the next generations, etc. So I think it is important. It's an important issue. Let's not go deny that. But public health is an important issue. In the developing countries, it's TB, it's malaria, it's cholera, it's HIV/AIDS. In the industrialized countries, it's cardiac problems, it's diabetes. Overall, it's a very low burden in terms of pandemics. So as well as rare, it's not a grave thing. They exaggerated the gravity of the threats. They're now exaggerating the urgency of the solution they're proposing. That's false. We should reject that.
David, if there was a chance that you had to sit down with a couple of politicians and explain to them two things that concern you most about what's being proposed in these draft documents that are due to be voted on next week, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it would be this essentially misinformation that is the basis of them in terms of risk and urgency. And the fact that they will inevitably divert significant resources, and you can show very clearly that that will almost certainly be a negative for public health. If you take significant funding from other areas, that's a negative. You're taking money from economies, particularly in low-income countries. We know that when you reduce GDP, you increase infant mortality. That's what will happen when we have these lockdowns. And the idea that is being put forward is essentially that there's a very heavy surveillance system. So we're surveilling for viral variants. We will find them because this is nature. On the threat of an outbreak, a pandemic can be declared, or a pandemic emergency. And the current Director General of W.H.O has done this when 5 people died of monkeypox. So we'll have lockdowns, they will impoverish people, and then we will have a 100-day vaccine, which is being supported with public funding. It'll be an mRNA vaccine, which CEPI is developing, and that will be the way back to freedom, and that will generate significant profit. So essentially for the pharmaceutical sector. So in a manner that's free, they're free from liability. So we're putting in place something which can become unstoppable, where we will find threats, we will have this impoverishing reaction and wealth concentrating reaction. And once it's in place, it's going to be very hard to get out of it, because there's a huge amount of money involved, and that can control media, it can control political discourse as well. And so we need to stop it now, and we need to just take a rational approach and a proportionate approach, which is the key to good public health policy.
One of the suggestions is that this won't be taking money from other areas of health, that this will be new money. What do you say to that?
No, well, unless you're going to print new money doesn't exist, does it? So, of course, it's going to come from other aspects of public health, or it will come from economies, economic development. It will come from whatever we spend money on now. So it is a diversion of resources. Undoubtedly, it will come from the health sector, because we're talking about huge amounts, for instance, of increase in overseas development assistance. Countries have less money now for that than they used to. So we saw it during COVID. There is a reduction in funding for basic sanitation and nutrition programs. So because it was diverted to things like mass COVID vaccination. So undoubtedly that will happen. And if people are saying that's not going to happen, they need to explain exactly where that money is coming from and why, if they're getting new money, it wouldn't be better spent on much higher burden problems.
I think the premise of that question, which is a question that is asked by lots of people, the premise is that somehow there is this magic money tree, and key concepts that have operated in Western societies for decades are being abandoned. The very notion of opportunity cost. There is a tax burden. Every increased tax is a burden on productivity. It dampens economic growth. If you're not going to increase the tax, then from where are you going to take in your existing revenue base, where are you going to take the money and direct it instead into pandemics? Cost-benefit analyses were abandoned. The whole notion, the metric of quality, the quality-adjusted life years was abandoned. Where taking a life of a younger person is far more unjustifiable and unjustified than of an elderly person. The whole notion, in terms of what I would say to politicians, I would actually ask them two questions. One is, if I have committed no crime and I'm not sick, on what basis, on what authority are you ordering house arrest for me? Lockdown is an abstract concept. In practice, that's what it means. The second question I would ask them is, take a country like India, a big country that accounts for 1/6 of the world's population. About 75% of people work in the informal economy. It's casualized workforce. It's daily wage labor. So when you lock down and you shut down all economic activity, what is the poor rickshawala going to do? And how is he going to feed his family? And what do you think will be the impact upon his children, upon domestic violence, upon the incidence of child trafficking, upon the incidence of girl trafficking into the sexual trade? These are real challenging problems in the real world. Move away from the world of Geneva and the international technocrats. So what is your answer to this? If you want to talk about compassion and kind and caring and virtue signaling, let's do that in the real world, not in the world of abstract models with percentage figures for this and percentage figures for that. So where are your priorities in proportion to the gravity of the risks out there in the real world?
It would be interesting to see what their answers might be.
Typical evasive deflection.
It's not abstract. UNICEF estimates that through COVID, another 10 million girls have been forced into child marriage. They estimated almost 250,000 young child deaths in South Asia in the 9-10 months from the start of COVID. So these are not abstract, and there's another 100 million people in the world in severe food deprivation. So a lot of those people will die. These are direct results from what we did in COVID, and this was known. W.H.O published in their influenza pandemic recommendations in 2019. It recognise that these are risks if you went down this path and recommended that you don't do it.
There was an article in the Australian, I think it was now 2 weeks ago. Sir Ashley Bloomfield, our former Director General of Health during COVID, is one of the co-chairs on the working group for the amendments to the international health regulations. And he was quite critical of some of the statements that you've made about the impact that these documents would have on a country's sovereignty. I understand that you've prepared a reply to that statement, which hasn't yet been, I think, included in the Australian editorial. What was your reply to that letter, and what is your position on the concerns about sovereignty?
Well, Sir Ashley was Director General in this country at the time that the Prime Minister famously said there will only be a single source of truth on all matters to do with COVID-related public health. That's a very dangerous concept and a dangerous statement. You need more rather than less open discussion by qualified and credentialed people so that people like me don't have to get involved. On medical issues, I would very quickly, in a debate with Sir Ashley, find myself totally out of depth because I have no medical qualification. I would submit with respect to Sir Ashley that in any conversation on sovereignty, he might find himself equally out of depth. I was senior advisor on reforms to Kofi Annan in 2002 and was the principal writer of his second reform report published in 2002. I was one of the commissioners on the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, not the formal title, that reconceptualized, and I was one of the main authors in this case, of the reconceptualization of sovereignty as responsibility on the part of states, and citizens become the rights bearers rather than states being privileged holders of sovereignty. I was involved in a small group in Canada that advocated for an elevation of the G20 finance ministers' annual meeting into a G20 leaders level meeting, a successful advocacy. And one of the reasons was, one of the justifications behind our advocacy was, the UN has legitimacy, but it's too cumbersome in decision making. The Security Council is completely out of alignment with the geopolitical realities. And the G7 doesn't represent the world. The world is much bigger than the G7. So do you get the G20 as the best mix? Makes agreements by informal discussions between the leaders of the systemically most important countries in the world that then needs to be ratified by the UN system in order to grant it legitimacy. In other words, I have dealt with issues of sovereignty in the professional capacity at the highest levels in some depth and detail. And I do understand those concerns. And as I said, to insist that because we say states retain the sovereign right, therefore there is no erosion of sovereignty, that is legalistic, that is being too clever by half. It is an attempt, I'm sorry to say, at gaslighting the public. It insults our intelligence. It is simply wrong. It is an example of misinformation and disinformation. It does have effects. It hands over control in the form of effective power of decision making on our health bodies. And then, as I said, they point the finger at each other, saying, no, we only issued an advisory, you're free to reject. Well, if I reject, then I'm become an outlaw. Why would I want to reject? So I think rather than put ourselves in a situation where in order to act like a sovereign state, we will have to defy international law, it's better to reconcile that in the text in the first place. Otherwise, and I'll finish with that in a different field, but very important for New Zealand, the NPT, signed in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, came into force in 1970. One of the 185 or so non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT was North Korea. In 2006, it exited the NPT. It has conducted 6 tests. It has, we believe, on best estimate, up to 50 bombs already. But guess what? The UN system still lists it as a non-nuclear weapon state. Because even though it withdrew under article of the NPT, that withdrawal has not been accepted as legitimate. We've also seen in the UK the difficulties of withdrawing under Brexit, even though they had the sovereign right to do so. So that becomes all very abstract and confusing and, as I said, too clever rather than a real response. There are genuine sovereignty concerns. We've seen that with the UK now expressing concerns about some implications of the treaty as they begin to look at it. We've seen all 49 Republican senators in the US transmit concerns officially to the President that they will reject this because of sovereignty implications. We've seen 22 state attorneys general say they will not allow the WHO writ to run in their states, and most recently 14 Australian parliamentarians and senators have written to the Prime Minister saying we need to rethink this. It has major implications. We should be careful of giving powers to the WHO to increase its own resources and look after the interests that are other than of public interests. So yes, these concerns are real. It will not do to try to dismiss them, whether it's done by clever slate of terminology or by deriding the critics. I think they need to engage with and address the concerns. And incidentally, the fact that they have, since the Director General in February speaking to the Summit of World Governments in the Middle East, made the harshest criticisms and uses phrases like a litany of lies. Since then, they have walked back many of exactly those provisions in earlier drafts, thereby implicitly conceding that maybe, just maybe, the critics actually got it right.
Dr. Bell, what would be your recommendation to New Zealand in the coming weeks when they may be called on to vote in respect of both of these documents?
Well, I think they should ask for postponement. There are obvious reasons for that. The financing of it is extremely opaque, but the numbers are very high. The evidence base on which they are put together is incorrect, is false. There has still not been an inquiry, a sensible inquiry into what happened in COVID. So they are recommending that we do these measures, which cost the world trillions of dollars without first seeing what worked and what didn't. And lastly, the international health regulations, I think as you mentioned, Article 55, paragraph 2, is very clear that there needs to be 4 months reflection, but after the last draft, before they vote on these provisions. So the WHO is breaking its own legal requirements in going ahead with this vote. With the pandemic agreement, it was supposed to be delivered 29th of March for the same reason, so that countries can have a look at how this impacts them from a health point of view, from a human rights point of view, from a financial point of view. And so to rush these votes essentially is a travesty of international law and of public health. It makes no sense at all. There is no urgency. It is purely to get something done, even at the cost of that something being a net harm to the world.
Could we take some questions from the press?
So if a government of a particular country, if a government of a particular country signs up and then a future government, due to election, changes, that same country stops complying, what consequences might they face?
It will depend upon the country concerned. If it is the United States, nil consequences. Because you destroy the system if you go after an influential, powerful country like the United States. If it's a minor, poor, weak country in some other continent, the consequences could be quite severe. But in the meantime, those countries have already suffered with this great diversion of resources and priorities from what is a real killer disease for their people. into something that is a luxury belief killer disease in the industrialized countries, given the reality, the hard evidence data-based reality of the burden of this disease on the world in both sets of things.
And I'd add that during COVID, the effects on GDP and economies in low-income countries greatly increased foreign debt. So they are very vulnerable now to financial sanctions and financial restrictions. And the World Bank and the IMF have signalled that they're very strongly behind this agenda. So yeah, it's going to be extremely hard for countries to stand up, particularly low middle income countries, and they're really reliant on the wealthier countries to actually take a principled stand on this.
Which are some of those countries that have shown opposition to this point? You mentioned Australia. I also know that there's American senators that have written a letter. Who else is?
Yeah, Slovakia stood out. The Prime Minister President of Slovakia indicated a week or two ago that they intended not to vote yes to these. There's
Netherlands.
The Netherlands. The Parliament asked the government to either vote no or ask for postponement. There's a letter tabled in the Uganda Parliament saying that there should be a postponement for all the reasons I outlined. And within the AU, the African Union countries, there's a lot of concern. They see this as which it is, as essentially a colonialist endeavour. It's a sort of corporate authoritarian-driven way of concentrating wealth from those countries and others to the sort of corporate bodies that are behind this. So but it's going to be, they are low-income countries, it's going to be very hard for them, and there's going to be a lot of pressure, and there is a lot of pressure on them to toe the line.
Excuse me. The mainstream media seems to have been pretty disinterested in this topic. What do you see as the consequences of them refusing to cover it in terms of public understanding of these issues?
Well, in terms of the self-interest, the consequences are very clearly mapped already. Dramatic fall in public trust in the mainstream media, in both legacy and social media. And you can see that across the Western world. Every poll that comes out shows exactly that. Vast numbers of people no longer believe that the press is faithful to its original mission of speaking truth to power, of conducting curiosity-based investigative journalism, of asking hard questions. And many of them became mouthpieces for government propaganda. And where you have, by definition, anything government says is true, and therefore anything that's critical of government policy is misinformation and disinformation. And then you have backflips and flip-flops with head-spinning regularity on a range of issues that we have seen. It erodes trust in all the public institutions. I think the fall in trust in the mainstream media is gravely damaging to the practice of democracy again. The press is an important intermediary between the people and the government. For that, it has to be independent. One of the sad truths, even more extreme in New Zealand from what I understand, is the extent to which the mainstream media has become financially beholden on government advertising and outright government largesse. I think that when I last looked at it, the two worst countries that I could find in the Western world on that were New Zealand and Canada in terms of the amount of money that they're getting from the government and the advertising. But just to go back to something else, even though it's not a question there, I think we have to recognize that W.H.O. first and foremost is an international bureaucracy. It's not a collection of the world's leading and best independent scientists. As an international bureaucracy, it has its own set of corporate interests in terms of powers and authority, in terms of resources, in terms of personnel. And increasingly, with the public-private partnership being dominated by Well, even though a lot of the money still comes from the public sector, it is what's called specified funding. That is to say, the donors don't contribute to the core budget and then leave it to the WHO to allocate its own priorities and the resources to them. Instead, they tell the WHO what they'd like their money spent on. The two of the biggest host countries for pharmaceutical interests are the United States and Germany. By sheer coincidence, I'm sure, these are the two countries, amongst the two countries most powerfully pushing the new changes. You can draw your own conclusions from that as well.
Was there a turning point in your career that brought you to these views? And was there a time in the past when you considered now to have been the wrong thing that you're working on?
For me, no. What I've been saying is orthodox public health. Yeah. I was taught in medical school in Australia that the reason we live longer now in wealthier countries is primarily sanitation, better nutrition, and then antibiotics had a big effect. And that, for instance, vaccines, which there are definitely important uses of vaccines, came very late in the picture. So this is why we have less infectious disease. This is why we have less pandemics and less outbreaks. Nothing in these documents, in this agenda, is about that. It is all about a commodity-driven, vaccine-driven response, which first by restricting people and then giving a commodity as a way out. That is not a legitimate public health response. It's not an evidence-based public health response. So I haven't changed my views on public health. I've changed my views on what drives large institutions and how they operate. But I think that's partly they have also changed over the years. And from my career, I've seen the increasing influence of the private sector and corporate sector on public health. It was very difficult 25 years ago for them to have influence. Now it's become very easy. And so I don't think that my views have fundamentally changed or my understanding of public health, but the public health sector has shifted a long way during that time.
Yeah.
I think I would answer that by going back to the end of the Cold War. The sole rationale for the creation of NATO was to deter and, if necessary, resist by force any Soviet aggression in Europe. Therefore, when the Soviet Union imploded and Russia emerged as a shrink-wrapped successor state, in terms of its original mission, its sole original mission, NATO should have been disbanded. But instead, an enormous set of institutional interests had grown up around NATO. And so the survival organization, the continuation of the organization, became more important than the original mission. And the mission was redefined. Why do I start with that? Because that's a paradox that affects every organization. And I don't mean just governmental organizations, it's true of NGOs as well. You set them up for a purpose over time and sometimes very quickly. The survival and growth of the organization itself becomes more important than the mission for which it was set up. And people begin to act like that. Even when I was doing the reform report for Kofi Annan, internally and in some of my public writings, I was warning against assuming that the expertise of the UN civil servants somehow gave them a technocratic legitimacy that could override the legitimacy of sovereign states. You have a unique legitimacy as the only authenticated representative of the international community, and that's the General Assembly. And then the charter that confers through that legitimacy certain powers in the United Nations. But don't mistake the technocratic expertise as a substitute for, let alone superior to, the democratic legitimacy of other states. And the example I took up was with capital punishment, which I individually oppose. But it's for states to decide through their own procedures and their own values where they draw the balance and whether they're going to do that or not. It's not for the United Nations to say, no, we will not do this and this because we believe it is, as a value statement, wrong or right or whatever. So I think that's an old familiar problem. And the longer an organization has been in existence, the greater and more cumbersome and more rigid the sets of vested interests holding it in equilibrium. So you could almost argue that every organization should require a refresh and realignment with present realities in order to escape from this. Now, we've been blessed in that we haven't had a major world war since 1945. And so all these institutions, by historical standards, demonstrate exceptional longevity. But that means there's more vested interests around them as well, and more anomalies have crept into the system, and they've become more cumbersome rather than agile and nimble and able to react to the real threats and problems. So it's not something new. It's not a sudden epiphany. I mean, there are some parts of the COVID response that were in that category. But the basic question was, where's the science? Where's the data? Why are you doing this? As opposed to expanding your own powers. Within countries, politicians handed over controls to the medical officers. That was a mistake. It's not the job of the chief medical officer to balance the priorities of whole of government approach. That's the job of governments. That's what they're there for. Parliaments abandoned their necessary scrutiny of executives, not just the press, but most of the judiciary and human rights machinery failed us in terms of the breach of core universal declaration of human rights provisions that exist with respect to rights to work, to worship, to assembly, freedom of expression, etc. And a lot of problems were shown up. So this is accumulation point of a lot of trends that were there but have now come together. And we need to think that through as well.
Yeah, I've got another question. Thierry Baudet, who's the leader of the Dutch political party Forum for Democracy, has spoken about the need to form a sort of worldwide anti-globalist alliance to push back against this sort of supranational legislation and other issues. What would you say to that idea, and how could potentially an alliance of countries work collaboratively to oppose these two, the pandemic treaty and the international health regulations?
I haven't seen that statement, and not having seen it, I'm not going to comment directly on what he, assuming it's a he rather than she, said. But I think the general point is a slightly different one. In our opposition, we need to be careful that don't in turn throw out the baby with the bathwater. We do live in an interdependent world. There is a greater need for cooperation to achieve common goals, a greater need to mute conflict, as with increased interaction, possibilities for friction are magnified as well. So it's a question of where we draw the balance between cooperating with other actors and countries and handing over control for our decision making to them. We should do more of the former. We should be wary of and do less of the latter. And that's where we need to do. So I'm generally very instinctively averse to that phrase globalist and anti-globalist for that reason. Now, one of the benefits of greater interdependence, paradoxically, is that we have gained a much broader range of immunity to a number of diseases, precisely because there is so much more and more frequent and more intense travel of people all over the world. And so one of the costs of lockdown, particularly for babies and young people, was the growth of what the medics call immunological naivety. They were not exposed to pathogens and germs, and therefore didn't develop natural immunity, which we have known since the Athenian plague is actually the most robust form of immunity against diseases. So there are lots of benefits from interdependence and globalization. Let's not throw that out. It does increase the opportunities for and need for cooperation. but we need to get that balance and the formal right, and that's what we are not doing in the treaties. We are claiming a legitimacy from a real problem, but the solutions run the real risk of worsening rather than improving the problem.
Well, as I said, we already have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have conventions on medical ethics, informed consent, etc., which were clearly abrogated during the COVID period and will be if we go forward with this. So we have the sort of norms and checks and balances supposedly to stop this sort of thing from happening. You asked about the media. The mainstream media seem to have completely abandoned its interest in human rights through this process. In most societies in the world, we have a basic understanding of this. We have a basic understanding that individuals should be able to make sovereign decisions about their own welfare and their own health. So I think we don't need to form, to a large extent, new movements, etc. We just need to recall the basics and emphasise these. And that this isn't a partisan thing, obviously. Human rights crosses a political spectrum, or it should do. So, I think there is certainly a role for countries to work together. There's a role also for countries to be separate in the expression of democracy. To do that, you need boundaries within which you can exert your democratic rights. But I think we have the sort of instruments to address this already. We're just not using them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bell. Thank you very much, Emeritus Professor Ramesh Thakur. And thank you very much for joining us here today at this press conference hosted by Reality Check Radio.
Thank you.